Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Stack Up series. Today we will be talking about Haas, and how well they compare to those constructors around them. So we'll be comparing them against RB, who finished behind them, and Alpine, who finished ahead of them, as well as the Haas drivers and where they compared to the drivers' standings around them in the races, and we'll see some graphs on where they finished and how their trend lines work. And look and see how that plays out overall, and seeing if they can compare to those drivers around them or if they're lagging behind or ahead of them. We will also see and talk about Oliver Bearman is one of these drivers, even though he only drove 2 races for Haas. I'm going to include the first race that he ran this season with Ferrari, just to kind of give it an even number, so it's not just having 2 races to look at. Here we will see some general stats for Haas and where they started each race on average and where they finished each race on the average, and have that breakdown by the drivers as well. I'm also including Oliver Bearman in this, as he drove 2 races for Haas, and he had that 1 race for Ferrari at the beginning of the season, which I included here just to try to give those numbers for Oliver Bearman a little bit better numbering, so I can figure out where his trend lines are going and whatnot in general. But you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at his numbers. So as you can see here, Haas finished in 7th position in the constructor standings. They had an average starting position of 13th and an average finishing position of 11th. They had a total of 5 DNFs. Of course, DNFs doesn't mean crashes. It just means that they had some issue with the car that could not finish the race. So that could be something that they ran into and broke, or it could be a true wreck, or it could be some other issues with the engines or something to that effect. So just have to keep that in mind. It's not actually crashing the vehicle in those races. Now we can look at that and say Haas actually gained a couple of positions on average for each race. Now they were just outside that point range for that average finishing position, so they weren't quite getting points all the time, but they were able to sneak in on those rare occasions when things were kind of messing up for the rest of the field and get into those point ranges. And so average are just outside the points, which is really good compared to last season, which they're kind of like lagging behind quite a bit. Now, if we break that down, we can look at Nico Hülkenberg, who finished 11th in the driver's standing. His average starting position was 12th. His average finishing position was 11th, and he had 3 of those DNFs throughout the season. So he was actually gaining position on average, just getting him just outside that point range, and we saw that a lot for him as he was able to sneak it up there and get those last few points on several occasions. When we come to his teammate, Kevin Magnussen, who finished in 15th, so a little bit farther behind him in those driver standings. He had an average starting position of 15th as well, so a little bit farther back, and he had an average finishing position of 13th. He also had 2 DNFs. So we can see that he was also gaining positions throughout the race on average. So he is starting farther behind Nico Hülkenberg and finishing behind Nico Hülkenberg on average, but is still able to gain those positions, helping Haas in those rare times that they could eke out those points when everything else kind of fell apart for the rest of the field. Now we kind of come to Oliver Bearman. As I said, only had 3 races that I'm looking at here. His average starting position was 12th. His average finishing position was 10th. He had 0 DNFs. Finishing drivers championship was in 18th. So still behind the other 2 drivers, even though he only had 3 races to compare those in and get those points. So he still did a very good job in that competitiveness these teams were in. He also gained 2 positions on average during the race. That's really good as well. So that's keeping the Haas's averages up, getting them higher into that area. And he was on average was getting that last position, that last point position for him. So that helps the teams out significantly on these back teams that are really struggling to try to eke out those points when they can. All of that looks really good. And you can kind of compare these drivers and see that Nico Hülkenberg did most of the work, with Kevin Magnussen doing a good supportive role and getting those points occasionally. And then you have Oliver Bearman kind of replacing Kevin Magnussen in those 2 races that looked really good for him, and that's why he's jumping into that car this next season. So here we will start off comparing the 3 Haas drivers in the sprint races, and we can see Kevin Magnussen in red, Nico Hülkenberg in blue, and Oliver Bearman in that yellow. Now for the first 3 races, we kind of find an interesting play out here with Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg almost going opposites in their sprint race finishes, and then eventually coming together as we go throughout this season. We also see Oliver Bearman in his one and only sprint race when he substituted for Kevin Magnussen in Brazil. So you get that one little yellow dot there just for completion's sake. And then we kind of see that team as a general between Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen get closer together between Circuit of the Americas and Qatar. Unfortunately, we also see that Nico Hülkenberg had a DNF in Brazil, so we can't really compare that race to anything else, even though Oliver Bearman was the one person that finished that race. Hard to compare the three drivers together in that run. Now we have the trend lines going down for both Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen, so that's good because that's the average finishing position, means that they're getting better and better throughout the season. We see that Nico Hülkenberg's trend line is going down faster, has a steeper slope, so that means he's a better adapting for that Haas throughout the season and then getting better faster than Kevin Magnussen is this season. And we kind of see that in the play out for the Drivers' Championship in their rankings. Now we can kind of also compare those results and see how Haas in general has done. They kind of had their cars mixed for those two drivers at the beginning of the season, or were able to compare and get those tweaks out so that both drivers liked the car at the end of the season as their results kind of came closer together. And I find that kind of interesting in this little play out here for Haas and the sprint races. Here we see a graph between Nico Hülkenberg and Yuki Tsunoda and Pierre Gasly on those same sprint races. So we can kind of see that same pattern flow between the three drivers at the beginning three races. They all kind of started off poorly, had a good race in Miami, and kind of got worse in Austria, even though it seems like Nico Hülkenberg had a worse case of it in Austria than the other two drivers. And then they kind of got a little bit average on that Circuit of the Americas, even though Nico Hülkenberg did a lot better in that race. And we're kind of tailoring it off between Pierre Gasly and Nico Hülkenberg in those final two races where Yuki Tsunoda was kind of getting worse those last two sprint races. So we can look at those. And of course, Nico is in blue and Yuki is in red and Pierre Gasly is in that pink, trying to match those constructors' colors a little bit. And we see those trend lines for Pierre Gasly and Nico Hülkenberg going down. It seems like Nico Hülkenberg is actually getting better, even though he started off worse than Pierre Gasly is throughout the season. So he's kind of given a better trend line in that result than Pierre Gasly was, who finished ahead of him in the driver's standings. And then Yuki Tsunoda, who finished behind him, kind of got worse throughout the season. Started off really good and kind of ended up poorly. I'm not sure if that was because of that RB development or if there was just so much pressure on who was going to be driving the RB and the Red Bull kind of playing into that factor as well. I think it's kind of interesting here that those first three races are kind of fairly matched in the pattern of how they're doing throughout the season, and they finally figure out how they're doing mostly between Pierre Gasly and Nico Hülkenberg throughout the rest of the season, getting better and better, kind of fine-tuning those vehicles, whereas Yuki is kind of hitting that mark not quite as well as the rest of them. And that kind of gives you the nice, good comparison on the sprint races, and we'll have to wait for the GP races for later on. So here we move on to comparing Kevin Magnussen against Alex Albon and Esteban Ocon. So we have Kevin Magnussen in blue, Alexander Albon in red, and Esteban Ocon in that pink again. And we can see that Kevin Magnussen started off strong on the sprint races and kind of had one bad race in Miami, but the rest of them seem to be fairly good, even though he didn't get to participate in Brazil. Now we compare that to Alexander Albon, who started off poorly, got a little bit better in Miami, then had another couple bad sessions in Austria and Circuit of the Americas, had a good race in Brazil, and then started tailing off again in Qatar. And Esteban Ocon was pretty steady, kind of yo-yoing a little bit, but pretty steady around that same trend line, kind of a flat trend line. Starting off decent, but not great, but kind of going back and forth on that run. So if you're looking at these three drivers, it seems like that Kevin Magnussen has a better grasp on how to get the most out of those sprint races compared to the other two drivers. And you can see Alexander Albon is getting better throughout the season, but is kind of lagging behind in comparison to Kevin Magnussen in this viewpoint. And that's why we have that gap in Brazil, is because he wasn't able to participate because of that race ban that he ended up getting for too many instances and points on his license. And so that's that gap there that you see, that you don't see a point for Brazil for Kevin Magnussen. And it's kind of interesting to look and compare those against Alexander Albon and Esteban Ocon in those few sprint races that we had this season and kind of how they played out in this driver standings compared to the 3 drivers we were looking at here between those markers. And here, just for completion's sake, we see Oliver Bearman compared against Daniel Ricciardo, and we had Franco Colapinto as his other driver who didn't actually get to compete in a sprint race. So here, it's kind of really hard to compare anything at all, but it just kind of gives you a general view for those sprint races, as Oliver Bearman was able to participate in the Brazil sprint race, where Daniel Ricciardo was in those first 3 races. Trend line is kind of going up, so that's not very good for Daniel, but we don't really get to see a trend line for Oliver Bearman. And of course, Franco Colapinto wasn't even able to compete in a sprint race, so it's kind of hard to even figure out where he would have ended up in these sprint races in comparison to these other drivers. And now we get to the more meat of the data here, where we compare Nico Hülkenberg against Kevin Magnussen and Oliver Bearman on all the GP races. So all those team members for Haas, you can kind of look at these lines and try to figure out where they play out. Now, that first race for Saudi Arabia for Oliver Bearman was with Ferrari, so just keep that in mind, and that's kind of why it's a little bit better than the rest of the 2 races that he was able to compete in. But just to give it a little bit more data for Oliver Bearman, I included it here. And we see Nico Hülkenberg in blue, Kevin Magnussen in red, and Oliver Bearman in yellow. And we can see that Nico Hülkenberg started off pretty poorly, but was able to really get back into line for those first several races, then had a bad stint around Hungary, and he ended up the season again in that nice, interesting position just inside those point ranges. So he's doing a really good job there. So he had a little bad stint in the middle of the season that kind of hurt him overall. Whereas we have Kevin Magnussen kind of following a little bit, doing a little bit better at the very beginning, kind of following along with Nico Hülkenberg, but had a bad set of races early on, had a good race here and there, and had some other bad races alongside of Nico Hülkenberg, and then it started getting better, and then started getting worse. So he's not quite the consistent factor that Nico Hülkenberg is. His trend line is still kind of matching him, just kind of offset a little bit, so getting kind of worse starting positions and worse finishing positions. We saw that at the early on with those stats, that he was still able to gain positions throughout the races, so that helps him out throughout this trend line, but not quite as well to start off with, so he couldn't finish quite as high up as his teammate Nico Hülkenberg. And we have Oliver Bearman's trend line going up, which is bad. Of course, we only had 3 races to really compare, so that's hard to justify. But even if we took off that first race that was for Ferrari, it would have been a much worse trend line if you just compared those 2 numbers. So it's kind of hard to see how he's going to play out next season, if he can get a really good grasp on that Haas or not, and really help out. Hopefully he can, by those statistics that we saw earlier, that he was able to get into that point range for those 2 races on average. Hopefully that plays out well for next season, and we can kind of generalized look on these 3 drivers for the Haas team. As we can see, Nico Hülkenberg pretty much handily beat out his other 2 teammates here, even though Kevin Magnussen was just behind him on those trend line in this run. So now we're looking at Nico Hülkenberg compared to Yuki Tsunoda and Pierre Gasly in the GP races. And we have Nico in blue, Yuki in red, and Pierre Gasly in that pink. And we can kind of see those numbers here comparatively, where Pierre Gasly had a very much good trend line going down, so he's able to really develop that at the end of the season, where at the beginning of the season didn't look so good for him. And that race in Brazil really helped him out, as well as Cutter getting those points, getting him ahead of Nico Hülkenberg in the driver's standings. Now we can see Yuki compared to Nico, where Yuki kind of started off poorly alongside of Nico and was better than Nico Hülkenberg in a couple of races, but then he had a DNF and came back strong ahead of Nico, and then he dropped off in that mid-season and seemed to get kind of at that same spot the rest of the season, even though he had a couple of good races like in Brazil, where he helped get up there as well in those finishing positions. But overall, I think it was kind of falling behind Nico Hülkenberg in that run, and you can kind of see that in that trend line, where his trend line is pretty much a stable trend line around that 12th position, 11th, 12th position marker. You see that Nico Hülkenberg's is kind of getting better, getting closer to that 9th position through the end of the season. So getting a better position instead of that steady line that Yuki had. So they kind of started off the same, and Yuki kind of stayed steady, where Nico Hülkenberg was able to adapt or get that car to adapt to him throughout the season in that development process. I think in that run, giving him the edge over Yuki, where Pierre Gasly had a poor car at the very beginning and was able to get that car running at the very end of the season and get some really good points that jumped him up ahead of Nico Hülkenberg by the end of the season. Moving on to Kevin Magnussen compared against Alexander Albon and Esteban Ocon. Again, we have Kevin Magnussen in blue, Alexander Albon in red, and Esteban Ocon in that pink. And this is a more interesting graph in my viewpoint, even though it's kind of a crazy mixture of finishing positions for all three drivers. Their trend lines are very close together in this, saying that they're really competitive in those vehicles that they were driving, whereas Kevin Magnussen was able to edge out the other two drivers. By the end, we have Alexander Albon with a nice steady red trend line going across that marker, just slightly getting better, I think, overall. And then you have Esteban Ocon just behind both of them in that Alpine that he was driving, not really liking that Alpine, but having that really good race in Brazil again for Esteban Ocon, which helped him out significantly in the driver's standings. But if you kind of compare the other two, it's kind of a mixture of how well they did for each race. So they're going back and forth over all three drivers. So it's kind of interesting to see how those trend lines are so close to each other overall. And you can kind of just, if you wanted to dive in and look at each race and kind of compare how each driver played out, we had several different people that had DNFs throughout the season, for Alexander Albon especially. So that kind of hurt him in this season, I think, in this results of how he could have potentially ended up. I think those trend lines are what really plays out and really stands out to me, how close they are and how these three drivers seem to be fairly evenly matched in this season. And finally, we get to Behrman versus Franco versus Daniel in the GP races, and we have Oliver Behrman in that blue, Franco in that aqua, and Daniel Ricciardo in that red. So we can see Daniel kind of lagging behind a little bit, but very steady throughout the season in that trend line, whereas Oliver Behrman and Franco Colapinto were getting worse throughout the season, even though Franco was getting worse faster than Oliver Behrman, so he kind of started off stronger and ended up worse in Oliver Behrman in the three races that Oliver Behrman ran versus the several races that Franco ran in that aqua setting. But comparative to Daniel, it's kind of interesting because you'd almost think that Daniel might have the experience, and shows in that trend line, even though the two new drivers are coming in fairly strong, showing what they can do ahead of him. And even though the trend lines are getting worse, that it seems like they're inexperienced and they're be able to push those limits and potentially finding those issues and the limits of that car, costing them some points, but giving them that ability to get around some of the other cars and keeping their finishing positions ahead of him overall in that comparison. And it's kind of hard to compare generally the three drivers because Daniel was more at the beginning of the season, whereas Franco and Oliver Behrman were more at the end of the season. So you have to kind of look at that and compare those drivers in the season that they were starting off with and where they're ending up with as well. Here we are with the three trend lines that you can kind of compare, and you can also kind of compare their finishing positions that seems to be like Oliver and Franco were pretty much always going to be ahead of Daniel in this run. And if you're kind of comparing Oliver Behrman and Franco Colapinto, it seems that maybe Franco had a little bit of advantage over Oliver Behrman, but it's hard to say when you only had the one race that both of them completed, and that was in Azerbaijan, where Franco was able to edge out Oliver Behrman, but it was still a close run. And between those two drivers, it's kind of interesting to see how that might be playing out next year if Franco ends up into that Alpine or not. That gets us through the drivers comparison. So we're going to look at the team overall and how they compare to the two teams around them. So we're looking at Haas compared to RB versus Alpine. We have RB in red, Haas in blue, and Alpine in that pink. And this is just kind of a score of where they got points in what race. And we can kind of look at those trend lines of those as well. So here it's the opposite. So if you're going up on those trend lines, that's the better because that's the more points you are getting throughout the season. So we can see that Alpine is doing much better at the end than they were at the beginning. They kind of started off very poorly, didn't make any kind of points until Miami. He kind of struggled in that middle section and then ended up having a really good run in Brazil, which helped them significantly. They were still getting better in Qatar as well as Abu Dhabi comparative to the rest of their season. So their trend line is going up faster than their other two. Where we see Haas, they were going up, but they were going up at a much slower rate than Alpine was. Having those few races in the the middle with Austria and Great Britain, where they were doing decent, and some more races at the end where they were able to get some more points, but not quite enough points to keep ahead of Alpine in that constructor standings. And of course, we have RB, who started off strong and had some good races in Austria and Miami, and a few points scattered throughout the area, but kind of tailored off as the season went on getting those points. So they had a nice steady or almost dropping trend line as that goes through. So that kind of gives you the nice easy comparison between those three teams, where they were able to score points and how that played out throughout the season. Now here we see the same team data, but it was just more of in a step graph format, so you can kind of see how they played out throughout the season and where they overtook each other on those points. So you can see they all kind of started off slow, but of course we had Haas and RB getting a little bit more points at the beginning of the season, and RB actually getting quite a bit of points at the beginning of the season. Looked like they were going to run away with that point scheme for the constructor standings between these other two teams, but then plateaued in that middle portion of the season and were able to gain a couple of points at the end, but not enough to stay ahead of the other two constructors. Where we see Haas got a few points at the very beginning, kind of plateaued early on, and then got some decent points in Austria, and then gained some other points in Mexico and Brazil as well, kind of edging them up, but not enough to keep them ahead of that Alpine team, which should start off the worst for these three comparison teams. Kind of overtook Haas a little bit in Spain, but then fell again, not quite gaining the points until that Brazil race, which shot them up ahead of the other two constructors, and they were able to maintain those points even though Haas was trying to fight back into that constructor's position. So that finishes up the Haas comparison on that stack up video, comparing those three constructors. So what's coming up next is how Alpine stacked up against the constructors and drivers around those three drivers that we have with them. And of course, I appreciate all the people that made it this far in the video, and I really appreciate those people that have liked those previous videos that I've had, giving me the incentive to keep going on this series. Thank you very much, and if you want to see the Alpine, I would appreciate a subscribe, so hopefully you don't miss this video as well. Thank you so much, and I will see you on the grid.